You recently wrote this piece in the New York Times about how even sort of seemingly benign uses of AI are actually quite bad and quite pernicious, especially for university students. Can you tell us a little bit about what the situation is currently with students using AI, speaking from your personal experience as a philosophy professor?
So there are two things that are happening right now. I can speak for American universities. I have very anecdotal evidence to suggest this is entirely global, but I can speak with confidence about what's happening here. And it's not two things, as I said, are happening at once. The first is that our students, like everyone on the planet, has discovered this new technology and are experimenting with it to perform their work. And so it is very hard to ascertain what exactly the percentage is of use of AI because we're relying mostly on self-report and people tend to report low, but it is entirely ubiquitous. Speaking from experience of my own class that I taught, which is a large general education class that is framed as an introductory philosophy class, I had very hard evidence that at least one half of students used AI on their final take home exam assignment. That does not preclude a much higher number using AI and just doing it in a slightly more sophisticated way. Just so it's clear what I mean, I wasn't deducing from that general sounding prose. I had asked them, in fact, about my own book that you guys have mentioned, mine and Rachel Wiseman's book, that has titles for antinatalist arguments that share a name with medieval theological arguments. And so when they put the question into the chat room, you can guess which answer they got. The chat reported on these arguments against the existence of God. So it's very transparent that the students had used the chat, but many more might have. And in fact, since I kind of went public with the piece, so many people have contacted me to say, I think you're really lowballing the estimates when you're saying half. I said, well, half is what I can talk about confidently. So the students are sort of exploring it, and they're using it as you can predict that they're using it, which is they are to do their assignments. Anything that they can get away with, they will use it for. I'll say more about what I think is going on there. I think there are different descriptions of what exactly is motivating them in these moments. But suffice to say that I don't think they're just trying to cynically cut corners. It's important to understand that at this point, the technology is so advanced that a lot of times students will at least feel and a lot of times be correct about them putting themselves at a disadvantage in terms of the assessment if they don't use the technology, because the technology is getting their classmates high grades. And so now we're sort of asking a student to take the high road and take a B, which is what they would produce trying to do it on their own. That's tough. And a third element that we really have to, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk a lot about, is the fact that at this point, these students are having fewer and fewer opportunities to practice the relevant skills at all. So they're also completely de-skilled to perform the assignments on their own. So the move to the AI feels natural. So this is what they're kind of doing on their own, quote unquote, getting away with it. And this is what we're seeing the universities in a piecemeal fashion trying to combat by, quote unquote, AI proofing our syllabi. We're trying to think, can we have different assessment methods? I'm sure we'll be talking about that today. What can we do to prevent this kind of unauthorized use of AI? But at the same time, and one I think can quite easily argue in strong tension with the kind of concerns that people express as we talk about this unauthorized use of AI, we see a lot of enthusiasm and practical efforts by universities to incorporate AI in education. Speaking for my own university that takes pride in being a leader of the pack in this regard, we have faculty encouraged to create customized chatbots. I can say it in a second. I'll say what that is. And in general, just explore every possible way in which we can take advantage, put it neutrally, of this technology. Now, the last thing I'll just say is I'll just for me, it was a bit mysterious. You see a lot about how AI can be rolled out and how it can advance education. So I try to do what I can to figure out what that means practically. What it really means practically is taking the chat that we're all familiar with, if it's Chat GPT, if it's Claude, and giving access to our students to the oftentimes sort of pay grade levels of it. So now
Hmm.
they're getting a higher version of it, and either kind of letting them interact with it. So all our students have completely free access to more advanced version than what we can get to as non-paying users, which is, as we know, quite sophisticated already. And in addition, I'm in a position to build a customized bot for my students to interact with, which really just amounts to me putting in a prompt. It's just me, as you would for your own prompt, as you go to your prompt and say, pretend you are my doctor, I can tell my student, I can tell the bot, pretend you're a philosophy professor, pretend you're Socrates, and kind of unleash its use to students. And I think it's really important to realize that both things are happening at once, because of course, we are at least undermining or confusing students, I think, often as we're encouraging both faculty and students to use the technology on the one hand, and on the other hand, kind of expressing these concerns about them using it in
Mm.
illicit ways.
So you described a sort of very broad spectrum of how students might be using AI, and also a spectrum of how universities feel about it, from trying to find ways to prevent AI from sort of sabotaging their assessments, or from kind of allowing students to merely kind of cheat by just getting someone, a computer, to write their essays, to universities kind of encouraging a use of AI under particular kind of constraints. What's original about your thesis in your piece in the New York Times is that you argue that, of course, most people would argue if students are just asking LLMs to write their essays for them, then that's no good. They're not learning anything. They're just pretending to be doing the homework. It's a form of cheating. University professors can't always tell. Sometimes maybe they can, sometimes they can't, and so this creates this whole issue of like, what is a university even for if that's what's going on now? But your argument is that even this kind of more limited, targeted use of AI that might be described as innocent or auxiliary, as you say in your piece, outline using it to create an outline of their essay, or create using it as part of their research, might also be deeply pernicious. And you say robs students of developing their linguistic capacities, and with that, essentially their cognitive capacities. So why tell us a little bit about why you think that even this kind of more limited use of AI can be that bad?
And yeah, and maybe worse. So if it's okay with you, I'm going to step back and I'm just going to outline my argument for why we should be worried about the use of AI by our students, abstracting from questions of the integrity of their grades or fairness. So I think the first reaction often is it's not fair that they're going to get a grade for something they didn't do. It's not fair to other students who are not using it. And I think that can distract us for, as I described, what are sort of graver dangers than letting them get away
Mm-hmm.
with cheating. And that's, as you quoted, this question of the development of our cognitive capacities. And when I say cognitive capacities, the first thing is to realize that I don't mean what you sometimes hear in this discourse, which is kind of very special skills. So a lot of times you'll hear people say, well, can AI write poetry? And I said, oh, I don't know if AI can write poetry. It looks like poetry. It doesn't have the human soul in it. Can AI give us that individualization? Well, we can make it say it's an individual, but is it really? And you get into these very rarefied debates where what's
Mm.
at stake is, I'll put it ungenerously to kind of make the case strongly. What's at stake is what a sort of a pro AI person could say is like a romantic ideal of what it is to be a human being. And you'll say, people are just holding on to this very romantic, humanistic, often sentimental idea of what it is to be a human being. And so they're saying, oh, the AI is jeopardizing that. But, just grow up, accept the future, don't be a Luddite, free yourself from the
Mm.
hold of this romantic ideal, and you'll see what AI can offer. And what I'm saying is that we need to I'm a humanist. I'm a philosophy professor. I study literature. I care about these things very deeply. But the threat that AI poses is not to these rarefied, very high level capacities, but in fact to our most fundamental, basic cognitive capacities. And what's important to see is first that our cognitive capacities, our ability to think, to take in the world, to interpret what it is that we're taking in, whether or not it's our natural environment, our man-made environment, or other human beings, to form ourselves vis-a-vis those inputs and then to communicate them outwards. These are incredibly fundamental and they're coeval with our linguistic capacities. Now, I'm not going to get at this point, maybe if we have time, to the intricacies of what it means to say that we're linguistic beings. And philosophers have a lot of different positions and how exactly to understand the connection between thought and language. But no one disputes that for us, in practice, in concreto, our cognitive development is one with our linguistic development. And let me just give a really basic example of what I mean. I don't mean that it's our capacity to read a novel, though that is also the case. I mean, it's our capacity to understand what I'm saying now, to decide what to do. When we teach our children to clap, to eat, to go to the bathroom, to make good choices for themselves, we do that all in language. When we make ethical decisions, that's in language. When we read a consent form, that's in language. When we learn anything in any subject, we do that in language. So what's at stake is the possibility of developing that. And I think the reason why we don't realize that is what is at stake is just because how ubiquitous it is. It's like the air we breathe. We do everything in language. Now, the thing about our linguistic capacities is that they're not innate. They're acquired. They require a long period of habituation in language. And in the case of literate societies, which are the kind of societies that have produced everything that we value and find worthwhile around us today, that means that we have to take things, quote unquote, to the next level beyond spoken language. And we have to be reading, analyzing those written texts, those long arguments, and producing language by composition.
Mm.
So by letting our students offload illicitly, however they will do it, and I'll talk in a second about the different uses, but by letting students offload, what we're doing is we're depriving them of the absolutely necessary conditions for becoming cognitively mature human beings. These capacities do not develop in the ether. In order to be able to cut the world at the joints, which is a kind of a figurative way of talking about what it is we do when we acquire a concept, we're trying to figure out, having our experience become more and more fine-tuned, being able to take on subtleties and the intricacies of the things that we have to be considering. That is something that requires work. And that work is the work in our world of reading texts that are at first, as children, longer than we would be inclined to do, thinking about them, and then trying to use those concepts ourselves. Now so this is a big preamble, but I think it's necessary.
Can I just challenge, before we go into more detail, can I challenge part of this argument and you get your response to how you think about it? So you said earlier you don't want to say that AI is robbing us of this sort of like very romantic idea of what it is to be a human, to write poetry, to have original philosophical thoughts, to write literature, all that. We're talking about more basic stuff. And someone listening might say, well, people don't need university education to develop the kinds of cognitive abilities that you're talking about. Most of these basic conceptual intellectual skills are developed much earlier in life, through school, when people acquire language. And that for the vast majority of people, for the vast majority of history, people didn't go to university and read scholarly books. It was a very, very small fraction of the population who did those things. So aren't you falling into the trap that you are saying that you don't want to fall in, which is having this very kind of high standard of what it means to have developed cognitive capacities as humans that requires something like a university level education?
That's a great question. So first of all, what's at stake, and when we're talking about the introduction of AI, it's a little naive to think we can isolate the idea of a university education and keep our high school education intact. So if we think about the education of a mature human being, we should be thinking about it from the perspective of how it really goes, which is there's a continuum. We go through our grade school education and then we have university education. So that's a really great way of putting the question, because it allows me to say, so I don't think that it's AI is jeopardizing that romantic ideal. It's not that I don't think we shouldn't be holding ourselves to high standards of cognitive maturity. And in fact, where I draw implicitly my standard is one way of thinking about it is to think about what is it that we think is required for just kind of like competent participation in political society.
Hmm.
So um, that you can look at human history and say, oh, people were not literate throughout it. And it is at that time that there is a strong argument for, or there's these that presents a challenge. A completely uneducated populace presents a very strong challenge to the idea of democracy. When Marx famously quotes the children, the teenagers working in the factories, saying Jesus Christ was the King of England, to kind of emphasize just how ignorant they are because of these completely depraved conditions in which they're growing up. It is a much harder argument to then say that these are the kind of people that everyone should be comfortably, in some sense, outsourcing some of their decision-making power over their lives to, because cognitive maturity that I have in mind is the cognitive maturity that's required to taking in what's at stake in our collective lives. I think that is the standard. Yeah, so I think that is the
But do you
standard that
think
I am for.
that's,
And so just to be clear, what institution exactly does it require? Could it be a 2-year community college, or does it have to be Harvard, or does it have to be something that doesn't happen in a high school? Sorry, in a formal degree giving institution. These are great questions. But when we're
mm,
talking about that cognitive maturity, and I think that is the cognitive maturity that kind of, the great theorists of democracy and of freedom in general have always understood that our goal is to allow as many human beings, all human beings who are capable of it, to reach that standard. And when we're
mm,
talking about, when we're criticizing an education system in grade school, in elementary school, in high school, or somewhere around the world, and we're saying it's doing injustice by the population it's serving, I think that's what we're holding it up to. We're saying we're not giving, I'll just say one last kind of formulation, we're not giving young people the tools that we owe them to be able to lead their own lives in light of like mature conceptions of how to live, let alone collectively direct the way for others.
yeah. I guess which institutions do that work is at the moment very politically relevant, as you know, because one of the political divides that has opened up in many societies, including the United States, and very much the same in the UK, is between university graduates and non-university graduates. So if someone's saying, well, you don't really have the full cognitive capacities to participate fully in political democratic life until you are a university graduate, I guess that does speak very much to what's going on at the moment, and a very kind of strong position to take. That's why I was sort of like slightly pressing you there
Yeah,
to see
I
what you
don't,
think about that.
right. So again, I don't think, I'm not equating university graduate. The standard isn't a university graduate or not. The question is what kind of um, capacity, as I said, to take in the world and its significance,
Mm,
to form oneself as a subject and an agent, and to be able to communicate that to others in an attempt, say, to persuade them that they should see things your way, that is actualizing our most fundamental capacities to be, yeah, cognitively mature and political beings. I let me say, this is going to sound tangential, but it's relevant. So um, here's a fun fact that I learned that I wasn't, I suppose, aware of, which is so here's a profession that you don't think requires a kind of a full university education: a plumber. A plumber is still plumbing requires a lot of calculation. It requires apparently kind of a really strong grasp of math. Most recently, I mean, literally this week, there came out a report about our kind of a cousin school, so another UC school. I'm in Irvine, and down the coast is San Diego, and the students at UC San Diego are now increasingly, sort of dramatically increasingly, students are coming in without the math skills of a seventh grader, of a fifth grader. Now, you can kind of wonder, how much math do we really need? So I looked at the questions. I love math and I was good at math, but I'm always like, who needs math? You know, negative number. Where do negative numbers come up in? And I looked at it, and a person who cannot do that math will not be able to grasp what a mortgage is, what a bank account is, because it's that basic. It's like basic grasp of fraction. It's basic grasp of being able to like direct your life so that you can have a secure life. So.
Mm.
And that is threatened, and I'll show in a second how, by letting our students, which is not going to happen just at university, it's going to happen from day one, cut those corners. And we can find equivalents to that in all of our walks of life. And I want to say really importantly, Alexis, because this touches on something that I really care about, two things. The one thing is, I think oftentimes in the name of wanting to practice a kind of egalitarianism and a concern to like give people their due, even if they don't have a university education, we can very easily kind of short shrift them in terms of what their interests and what their aspirations are. This has to do with the work I do. I can get into it, but there many people who don't go to university are still lovers of literature. They're still curious about the world. They still read nonfiction. Their lives, they think of their lives as rich with intellectual, artistic, and cultural ideas, even if they didn't go to a top school or even something else. And so I think that's one thing that's really important. And the idea of not holding all of us collectively to a high standard in sort of to cater to these people who don't care about culture and intellect, I think can really actually kind of deprive them of the dignity that they in fact have. And I want to say something else, because there's another way in which this kind of point, or something it's related to and it's wrapped up in. People think and say that AI can help us bridge equality gaps. So the thought is that once we let everyone have access to AI in education, can bridge the gaps between bad and good teachers. It can bridge the gaps, like you're saying, between people who have teachers and don't have them at all for whatever reason. In fact, what is happening already and what is going to happen going forward is that the exposure to AI in education is only going to broaden the disparities that most fundamentally happen across socioeconomic lines. It's going to drive inequality in education. It's already doing that now. It's the students that come with strong backgrounds, with parents who are going to make sure that they get the skills that they need. I had a colleague who's not in the humanities, she was in economics. She won't let her kids anywhere near a screen and said, our kids are going to have a superpower. And she said it to me like we're in collusion. She said, you and I, because we don't let our kids do this and we know better. And it was almost insidious. I'm telling it like it's evil, but it gave me chills.
Yeah. And you're
they're going
critiquing
to
your
rule.
piece.
And she said, this is what she meant. She said she's going to rule all those other kids that in the name of equality were handed a device with an AI on it and who cannot compose a sentence, right? In the name of that equality, they now cannot compose a sentence. And it's our children who are going to be able to actually do anything in the world and use AI to the extent that they need to intelligently.
Yes, and you critique in your piece the sort of like complacency of some professors in Ivy League schools that say, well, maybe reading isn't for everyone, maybe only elite university students will end up, having to read these long tests and everyone else can do, like, as you say in the piece, like sing songs and kind of memorize things. It's sort of this thing that others have pointed out as a cultural phenomenon, which is kind of that we're moving past this kind of literary phase into a sort of oral phase of or going back, regressing to a kind of oral phase of culture.
Can I, Alexis, though, your
Yeah.
question that you actually asked, I don't want to lose it because it's such an important one, this is my fault. I took us on the tangent. But you started by asking, why is it that even these kind of innocent, benign uses of AI are actually so pernicious?
Yeah.
And is
So
that okay? And
that's at the core of your argument, yes, which is,
well, it's the core
even if
of the
I'm not
headline
writing
they
my
gave
whole
me. Yeah.
essay, why is it bad if I just sort of like brainstorm with the AI and kind of ask
With
him
the
to,
AI, yeah.
yeah, yeah.
So, and I did feel that I had to do the whole big preamble to say the following, which is the uses that they call innocuous, we need to think seriously about what they actually entail. And I think when we do, we realize that what we're doing here is offloading actually the hardest, which means sometimes like the most basic and most
Mm.
important parts of the writing. And it's important to remember that, as Aristotle already tells us, in order to get good at something, you have to practice it. There's no other way of getting good at anything. Any activity, you have to perform it. And before you are good at it, it can be uncomfortable and painful. The point where pleasure kicks in is when you start getting good at it. So if we look at something, say, like a summary, we say, why? Well, the AI is providing the summary. Well, what is a summary? A summary, what is a short circuit? Well, it's the task of figuring out what this piece of writing is trying to tell me. What's its main point? How is it delivering that main point? How are the different registers of tone working? What are the different moving pieces are doing? What's an example and a counterexample? What's an objection? Which bit of it is an invitation to think something further and speculative, and which is core. I see, and every single one of my colleagues sees right now that these are exactly the kind of things our students cannot do anymore. We're seeing them, in fact, they cannot track, for instance, as a philosopher, a claim and an objection. They just know it's happening on the page. So this apparently innocuous task, and it's the task, importantly, that students are going to continue performing even as we AI-proof our syllabi, and that's crucial. That is the actual absolute bread and butter of getting to a point where you can do the following: read a book cover to cover. This isn't about university education, not university education. It's about, do you have the ability to read a book cover to cover, or even like a long form article cover to cover, or even just read an op-ed, this very bastardized mainstream form of getting an argument across. Can you read it and say, that's what they're arguing, and these are kind of the reasons that they give? And if you cannot do that, then I'm not ashamed to say, and I don't think it's elitist at all. I think it's actually like, it's the call of the working man and woman. It's the call of the people who do not have that education to say that that is unjust, it's unethical to deprive people of the opportunity to get to a point where they can perform that task. The same thing goes, what's an outline? An outline is trying to think, I have this jumble of ideas. How am I going to make it into something that coheres? And how am I going to communicate that to someone else? This is basic. It's basic within a personal relationship. It's basic if you have any ambition to become a leader. It's basic if you have like the desire to have social progress, or introduce a new idea in the workplace. Brainstorming. I mean, that one really. So that is saying that gets my goat. Brainstorming is you trying to figure out whether or not you have anything to say. What is this? The idea that you can offload that bit of it, but this is somehow innocuous and merely teaching you how to work. So I think with all of these auxiliary functions, without exception, we can see that what we're offloading is an incredibly difficult, uncomfortable, and to this day, some of these things, I don't necessarily enjoy them because they're hard, because I'm still becoming better and better at them. And we're depriving a student at the earliest stage of the opportunity to learn how to do that task. And I think that's why we should be incredibly careful about it, not just kind of encouraging to use it, but as we're thinking about quote unquote AI proofing our syllabi. I don't know if you have any educators with us today, but I'm one, and in some capacity we all are. as we're thinking about AI proofing, we have to remember and ask ourselves, okay, we haven't allowed them to cheat in some technical, literal sense. But are we giving them the opportunities to read along? Like, are we making them read along text, think about it, and compose it on their own? And if we're not, I think we're
Mm,
not serving our students anymore.
yeah. I mean, the question of the talk was how to prevent AI from making us dumb, and I think, as I hinted, the answer might be simpler than one might think, which is just don't use it. Just don't use AI to that extent. Don't use it in that capacity, and create the spaces as educators for students to be able to do that.
Well, so I agree with you that that bit is well easy in the sense of it's kind of a neat claim. It's not a complicated claim. I think it's very hard to figure out how you do that. So as a assuming we're all adults in some way or another. As an adult, if you tell me just don't do that, even there, I think there's a problem. But at least it's kind of a coherent claim. You want to protect your own cognitive abilities. You're a master of your own life. You can, just don't use it. That said, a lot of people, and I think smart, ethical, and responsible people will happily admit that they have to, for instance, put away their phones, get rid of a smartphone,
Yeah, I was just
break
going to
their
say, yeah,
phones.
with smartphones, it's
And
not.
they say it's because if I were to have it, I would use it. And we know that the technologies, and something is the same is true of AI, especially in some of its uses, but the technologies are built to suck us in and to maintain us engaged. I believe in free will. I believe we all have the power to say no to a chocolate bar and to our phones, but it doesn't mean that it's as simple a matter as just saying, well, just don't. But this is really important in this piece. Certainly, I'm not thinking about adults. I think there's a huge difference between what we say when we say to another adult, well, if you don't like it, don't do it, and what our responsibilities are vis-a-vis children or kind of
Mm,
people who are still acquiring these capacities. And that's because I see a lot of my colleagues kind of say that, well, if they're cheating themselves out of an education, that's on them.
mm.
Now, I don't think that vis-a-vis my very small children, I think that's as ridiculous as saying, well, if they want to cheat themselves of a healthy diet, that's on them, and letting them see what they do with their Halloween candy. Um, as I said, and this is
But when
before,
it comes to university students, I guess it is adults that we're talking about.
I don't think so. I don't think
No
so.
longer.
Not in terms of I think in some way not ever because we're still directing their education. I think in many, I mean, they're not 3 year olds, they're not 12 year olds, and they're not even 16 year olds. It doesn't mean that that our responsibility towards them as guides and kind of shepherds, educational, pedagogical, intellectual, and ethical shepherds have ended. That's just a strong, I can talk about why. Um, but why is because I think they're still within the age range where these capacities are still developing. For the capacity, I did not come into college with the same capacities for analysis and composition that I left with. And I'll say something about myself. It it was crucial for my own development, having come from a background where I did not come into college appreciating humanistic work, let alone philosophy, that the structure of incentives that I encountered was such that I was forced to perform the tasks that I would not have chosen to perform on my own, would not have enjoyed performing, and so would not have been self motivated to do so, and can only appreciate their value having then gone through that course of education. And so that's a way of saying this is why I think that these people, why do I think they're not adults just in the relevant sense? I mean, I think they're adults in many other respects, politically, ethically. I mean, we can talk about that. But the reason why they're not adults in the relevant respect is that they're still such that if they're put in the right structure of incentives to perform certain kind of tasks and practice certain kinds of capacities, they can come to appreciate their value in a way that they could not do before.
I
Okay,
have
and I take that
two.
to be our responsibility.
I have two questions. to finish off. I mean, maybe we won't get to both of them, but one is whether there's another kind of easy solution to this crisis, which is a lot of these problems arise out of the fact that students are assessed by essay writing and coursework or final term essays and things like that they can write at their own time at home with access to a computer, with access to a smartphone, all the rest of it. I mean, why would the problem not be solved simply by moving universities to not such an old-fashioned way of assessing, which is, I think, up until the pandemic, was pretty much standard in many UK universities, which is to have a final, have work done throughout the year, but not assessed, not something that will count towards your grade, and then all your, performance, as it were, is assessed on written exams under supervision without access to laptops. And so if you do just ask ChatGPT to write your essays throughout the year, then you're going to fail, of course, and not be granted a university degree. And presumably that, disincentivizes or would disincentivize people from then relying on that technology, because they would know they can't get away with it. They would have to put in the work in order to get a degree, which is part of the reason why people go to university. Why would that not work?
So I think that's a great question. It has sort of different moving parts. So there's one version of the question is, why can't we just move to in-class assessment? And I'm going to abstract for a second from a tutorial system. So just what's wrong with just in-class assessment? Let's just have them discuss in class. They can have quizzes, and then at the end they can have a take-home exam. And as you say, it's actually not unheard of. Even in sort of lower division undergraduate courses, this was something that was and was still being practiced. The function of an exam, a classroom exam, is different if it's part of a constellation of opportunities to practice those develop those capacities, practice those skills throughout the year, and whether or not it's standalone. So when I was taking an English course for which there was an exam, I was still writing papers throughout the year.
Yeah, you can still do that. It's just your grade won't be dependent on them.
Yeah. So I'll get to the UK system, but it's important to kind of see it. So here's what's happening now in everyone who's AI proofing their syllabi in this way. The students preparing for that exam, their way of preparing is very different. They're now preparing with the chat. The chat is now performing those tasks of summary, of organizing their thoughts, of coming up with the evocative examples that are being called out to give on exam day. So, and I've read something. I always find the most heartbreaking and most important things about this that actually come from students. It's because we sit here, we're kind of older, we're talking about how they're not adults. It's very important to hear from students who talk about, words don't come as easily to me anymore. I can't read sentences anymore. I feel completely dependent on it. You can hear the mental health is suffering. On AI proofing their syllabi, somebody wrote for The Point magazine, where I'm an editor, wrote to us this just absolutely beautiful piece. Maybe I'll try and quickly find it and put it in the chat. As a student, an undergraduate, and she said, the first thing is now there's a dynamic of complete enmity between the overlord kind of instructors and us who are trying to find us out. And the second thing is, she said, I've become ChatGPT, because the thing that I'm asked to perform on that final exam, I think like the LLM now, and that is not a compliment. They're abstract. There's a qual, I'm just regurgitating. And so the students feel like something really big was taken away. Now you ask about the tutorial system. Here, it's kind of, I guess, a subtle disagreement, and maybe we can just kind of, maybe there needs to be an empirical study that will determine this. My intuition is that what you're describing as well, and if they want to deprive themselves of the opportunity to do well in the exam, let them. I feel we have a little bit more responsibility towards our students, and we can do more for them than just say, you won't be able to do as well in the exam as you, if you won't write the essays yourselves during the year. I think students today, encountering the academic pressures, encountering the professional pressures, coming in. I mean, you kind of hinted at it, also coming in with like a lot more mental health issues than before. They're
Mm.
coming in feeling quite incapable. I think the desire at midnight to get another class in, or I don't know, apply to another internship or whatever it is that's going on in their lives, work. A lot of students, if they're not at top university, they're working. And so the incentive structure is such that I think that it's ultimately not responsible to just say, well, you're going to harm yourself on the final exam. I think they will be using the AI. We see the students on it. All the students know they're not learning. A lot of
Mm.
them say, I lament this. And yet they're saying, I'm stuck in a vicious cycle with the machine. And so my guess would be that that is what's going to happen. And it's not, and I, as an educator, feel it's not enough. I can do more by them than to just say, you're going to cheat yourself out if you don't do it yourself. Because I think the AI is going to be there, they're going to go for it, and they're not going to develop those cognitive capacities adequately.
Mm. Um, I have more questions, but I'd also like to get to the audience's questions. Um, so let's see. So Bill Usman asks, I'm at a university where the administration is pushing AI to both students and faculty. Our provost keeps saying she is so excited about this. Any suggestions for how faculty can push back against administrators who are advocates for the AI industry? And I guess that can be a sort of ill-motivated, but sometimes, coming from a sort of well-meaning disposition, which is, some people think AI is just going to be part of life now. So, students need to learn how to use this properly or to use it cleverly or whatever.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we're not training our students for the 21st century. They're getting an education that is no longer applicable to the world we live in.
Yeah, so let me say actually something about that rationale, which is our students will figure out and have already figured out how to use it like really well. They absolutely don't need our help. And if they need our help, you can have one class, you can have a course that everyone has to take, and they learn all those. Sorry, I can't even say it without smiling. Like all those like the hard work of working with the AI, and I say that because part of the enormous efforts happening right now in AI is not to develop the LLMs. It's to develop more and more and more applications that are precisely making it so that there's nothing to learn about using it. Like done all the work, and all you're doing is kind of inputting what you need. And I'll also say that it's so much the case. It's not just a problem in philosophy and English departments. Computer science are
Mm.
seriously complaining
I did want
that
to
their
ask
students
whether,
now.
yeah, that's just a humanities
Absolutely. And in
problem or not.
fact,
Yeah.
a lot of times it's the humanists and humanist social scientists that are insecure about the technology. And so they're kind of like what you say, they're afraid to seem like they're against
Mm.
progress and they're not keeping up with the times. And the computer scientists are like, I know what's going on. I'm not putting out people that companies won't hire because they cannot write code. It's one thing for a senior coder to use AI, but the junior people are useless because they cannot help themselves from using it.
Mm.
And just to go back to what you're saying before, Alexis, they know, they have the information. If you don't know how to do it, you're not going to be a valuable employee, and yet they can't help themselves, and they do. So that the idea that
Mm.
the far away incentive for a young person will be sufficient is something we should doubt. To the question of what we should do, that we have to also remind ourselves the technology is so new. We're all figuring it out. I'm doing everything I can, including being here today, I think, to try and figure this out. The most important, and I think one that measured, I think we can persuade people of it. I think it's easily implementable, and I think it's incredibly valuable. Is to go back to what I said. The most important thing that we can give our students is the opportunity to develop the skills and capacities in the first place. I think the way to do that is not by trying to kind of use the AI in very baroque and complicated ways. I think it's by giving them tech-free spaces. Now, tech-free space is not a very expensive thing because it doesn't require any equipment. So I think that what we should be all encouraging, and what I will be doing, is trying to create spaces where students can come in, take their phone, check their phone in like they do in high schools, like they do in certain kind of, we'll do this in a workplace, put their phone, maybe have their laptop with the Wi-Fi is turned off, maybe not have the Wi-Fi figured out. They come in with a book, maybe a question that they got from the professor, and they sit in that room. I think it's very easy to create a structure of incentives, whether it's per class or per their entire degree. But you can easily imagine giving extra credit or giving a part of the grade that is just awarded for you sitting in that room, banging your head against that book, as we all used to do. I think that the time spent doing that, it will be more valuable than any equivalent amount of time trying to figure out the same book using the chat, prompting you and having that conversation, which really is our only alternative. So it's a really simple measure. And I think we should be, and I think that's what we should be calling for, like, first and foremost. The reason why I think it could be persuasive is I think you can advocate it by just talking about balance. You don't need to be talking about how any exposures of of students to AI is completely detrimental to their development. We just need to say, if we want to be real leaders on this, we probably want to be able to provide our students with balance. They have access to the chat absolutely on every square foot of their lives, of their campus, of their dorms. Let's give them the smallest space where they could be without it, and they can perform that task, that cognitive acquisition task. So it's easy. You don't have a Luddite. You're just calling for balance. It's, as I said, cheap and easy. And I think that it provides something for students that I believe they're going to find incredibly valuable. But the second thing that I think is very important is to try and find the people who feel the same. A dynamic that I have discovered ever since putting out this piece in the New York Times is that so many people feel like I do, or like perhaps the person who posed the question does, but they don't want to speak up in the faculty meeting because they feel like they're the only one, and they want to be the odd one out that's kind of not getting it, as everyone's really excited about these tools or pretending to be. And so I think it's really important to try and find those people, to find out you're not alone, to find out there are a lot of people who are like-minded, not just in the humanities. I mean, my big collaborator, I'm kind of thinking, which audience is this? I think I'm not saying too much. My big collaborator, practically speaking, on campus, which is post this op-ed, is an endowed professor in AI. That is in his email signature. I didn't know you could be an endowed professor in AI. He is. He sees things as I do, and we're thinking together, how can we present things to our administrators? And it was two things. One, we came up with this practical measure. And the second thing, we said, let's find people who feel the same. Find the people who feel strongest about it, create a little coalition, put up the measure, and then others will come to support it.
Very good. So another question by the Rothstein family, I imagine it's one representative of it, says, I love what Dr. Berg is saying, but she's treating AI as if it's just a new tool, like a beefed up calculator, when it signifies a civilizational shift. Doesn't the question become, what even is a cognitive mature person for in this kind of new, fully expressed AI era? So I guess the question is, okay, we might try and preserve these things, and maybe there's a certain level of thinking, because we love reading books and we think highly of thought, that we think these things are really valuable and going to be really important, even if the world doesn't think that. But is that just sort of thinking, sort of doing the thing that philosophers do since Plato, sort of like slightly over-exaggerating the importance of cognitive and intellectual capacities, and maybe in a fully automated AI era, these capacities will be a luxury, not really necessary?
Yeah, I don't think Plato ever overestimated the intellectual capacities. Let's see.
I'm thinking of philosopher kings, that the people that should rule should be philosophers.
The argument is still correct. The problem with the philosopher kings is not that the argument is bad. We won't elect them. Okay, so I understand the question, and let me answer it by saying, I hear in the question something, one version of it is something like, are you just trying, this is a huge world historical development that's changing what it, what it means and what we can, what it means to be, kind of what it means to lead a flourishing human life and what is possible in terms of leading a flourishing human life.
Mm.
And perhaps this conversation is how I'm attacking it, like a very particular corner of things. And so I have a lot of things to say about the world historical movement. I also, in my analysis, am not incredibly optimistic about, maybe that's kind of where I do agree with Alexa, or I don't,
Mm.
Heidegger
Mm.
famously says only God can save us now. And he, to a question of like, what can a philosophical intervention do right now? And he says, well, I don't think a philosopher is a political activist. I don't think I have that power. I don't think any philosopher has that power. That said, I don't think the question of how to educate children into adults is like a sideshow or just like an aspect of the problem. I think that for every educator that hears me and introduces 1 hour a week for their students to spend in that tech free room and just holding a book without having a phone anywhere near them and just trying to read these difficult lines, I think that is valuable, even if the world historical movement is not stopped. I think that is a person who is that much more likely, even a little bit, to take in the ethical significance of what's happening. It's a person who's more likely to be able to care about it because they're not developing this capacity to not, to not
Mm.
be in a mindless scroll. So, and I think that's kind of all I can do as a public intellectual. It's a kind of embarrassing title, but let's use that. As an educator in my university and as a thinker, as I can give others, encourage them, and give them the tools to like secure just a little bit of that. In the same way, you can have a world historical event or a world national event of kind of that is horrible, and you can think, well, I can do something with my direct children. And this, I think there's a strong analogy there. I can reach out the students that I can reach the educators that I can reach, and if we can help them preserve a little bit more of our humanity, then I've done something good.
Okay, I'm trying to, because there are lots of questions, I'm trying to sort of
I'll try and be less long-winded.
filter them
Pardon.
out. Yeah, let's try and do a couple more. Um, there is someone asked why single out AI. There's lots of new technologies that we rely on and have arguably robbed us of certain skills. This person points out to, for example, we all rely on GPS and Google Maps these days.
Yeah,
We've lost the
that's a
ability to
great
read a
question.
map. Yeah.
Yeah, I understand the question. Um, I don't. The short of it is that they all do come at a cost. Actually, if you're interested, there's like a little thing about it in the op-ed. In fact, I think did get to say it, but there's a cost to the introduction of all of these technologies. Famously, Plato in the Phaedrus says through a mouthpiece, but he says, writing
Mm.
itself is going to make us
Hmm.
forgetful. Writing has also enabled us to have access to the Platonic dialogues and and everything else. So the question is also cost and benefit. The reason why I single out AI, or one answer to it, is because here the cost outweighs the benefit, and because what is at stake is not a particular skill. It's not the skill to read a map. It's, as I said, and this is why I did do that big preamble about language, it's just a very basic cognitive capacity. It's the capacity to like break the world at the joints. It's the difference between having, 5 words for our emotions and 100, and if and kind of realizing that complexity is not just a matter of being a sophisticated intellectual. It's a matter of being able to have human experiences that are not all just coarse, crude, to have nuanced interactions, ethically nuanced interactions with others, appreciating the complexities of our interactions. That's what's at stake, and that's why I quote unquote single out AI.
Perfect. Carl Alston asked a question that sort of, again, touches on something we didn't talk very much about, which is they say ideas and arguments can be made through arts that do not entirely rely on textual linguistics, the varieties of knowledge formation that are potentially cut off from using generative AI. Does your analysis rely only on written language as a challenge, or are there other modes that you're connecting to this critique? I don't know if the person has visual arts or music in mind, or I don't know. what the...
Yeah, I mean, you can. I'm very happy to see the argument. As I said, people in computer science, who are we're talking about the capacity to code, are having the same concerns. I do think, and I'm happy to see the argument extended elsewhere. I do think, as I said, what I'm insisting on is a kind of fundamentality. It doesn't mean it's more important. Something being fundamental and basic doesn't mean it's more important than like music or the visual arts
Mhm.
or I don't know, mathematical capacities. But there's something incredibly basic to our ability to acquire language. And so my thought is, I'm kind of trying to go to the jugular of the argument. I do care about poetry, but I think that if we talk about poetry, we're not focusing on the thing that we cannot deny, whose significance we cannot deny. And so that's where my focus on language comes from.
Mm. Okay, one final question. I wanted to ask something similar, which is why, and you've touched on it, about why it's extra important for students and why, when people are particularly vulnerable to having their developmental capacity sort of sabotaged. But what about the rest of us? And what about people, who are out of university from many years? And what about people within workplaces? So Barris Bilgin says, can you comment on the impact of losing cognitive activity to AI beyond education into the rest of life? Workplaces are now pushing the use of AI, arguably depriving employees of experiences that would push them to learn by doing things that are opposed to fast-tracking AI-generated solutions. This talks also to some of the memes about AI taking over some of the more fun parts of work, which is a kind of more creative thinking bit, and then allowing the kind of drudgery bit of work to be done by humans. How do you think about those?
Oh, that's funny. I haven't seen that. Yeah. I mean, I think the argument that I'm presenting extends to a great capacity to adults, whether because, as I at least think of myself, I'm still practicing and becoming better at certain things. And if I don't try and do them, I will not get any better at them, which means that whatever pleasures there are in being able to perform those and engage in those activities meaningfully are closed off to me, and whatever meaning there is there. Um, so that's kind of the one way of extending. The other one, and this week I have a tremendous amount of empirical data on, is this question of skill attrition or skill atrophy. So we see that, we talked about what it takes to acquire a skill.
But we can lose them as well.
It's the fact that it actually, yeah, it takes, some of them take maintaining. And so we see that with doctors and doctors' reliance on AI, and they're no longer able to perform, of course, and we need them because we need them exactly where AI can no longer perform the job. And now we have them compromising their most basic levels of their ability. So they're, and the threat to the highest level of their ability is just sort of tremendous. And we see that across the board. Indeed. I mean, so 100% at that case, just also in terms of the tools, if I had the tools to, well, I don't know. This is questions of self-rule and democracy. It had the tools to let you guys not rely on AI and destroy your capacities for thinking. Would I do it? That's a deep philosophical question. But that at least raises the question. I think with the younger people, I just don't. I think it doesn't raise that question. I hope that people here do exercise their better judgment. I do find, interestingly, it's kind of a real. There's still a kind of threat that actually AI is quite useless, or at least now, no one has really cracked like a real, true, good use of it. There's some in coding, some over here and there, but it's remarkable how much even companies who try to actually offload whole tasks can't quite make it happen. And anecdotally, people who are not doing my job at administrators at universities will say, I go to a webinar after webinar telling me how to use AI, but by the time I create the prompt for it to write the email, I could have written 3 emails. So I think there's also a kind of habit and use to working with the AI that is not clear if it's actually time saving for the work that is required. That's just a parenthetical. As people say, it becomes a real habit. The other thing, actually, that's interesting, though, because we've been just talking about skills and capacities, is that, of course, I think the majority, and if not something very close to it, of the use of AI is not work related among adults. It's education for young kids and college students, but it's constant advice. It's kind of social, a lot of weird sociability,
Mm,
and a lot of people kind of running things but the AI. It's the kind of things that you know that if you ask your partner, they might roll their eyes at you because you're like, should I take out the laundry? And they do it with AI.
mm,
So
mm,
it's
mm.
kind of important just to remember that there's this kind of whole weird social dimension to our interaction as well.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. People using them as romantic partners or as therapists or yeah, a whole host of other things.
Yes, but can I just say, like, everyone knows, like, the romantic, it's there's titles for, there's a title for a therapist and there's a title for a girlfriend, and everyone knows, and you can write a story about it. But the truth is that it's a lot like my health insurance, my taxes,
Mm,
and
like
like
a
how should I
PA.
organize my trip? Yeah, it's a PA, but it's like it's like for the bits that the PA doesn't actually want to do. It's like a lot of this kind of weird daily emotional task management. Anyway,
Mm, mm,
make of it
mm.
what you will.
Lots more to discuss.
Indeed.
Anastasia Berg, thank you very much for this.
Thank you so much. This was such a great opportunity to think a lot more about these questions.